A phone call. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. That's all it took. The kind of call you don't expect on a Tuesday morning when you're standing in a hospital break room with cold coffee in one hand and somebody else's chart in the other. The kind of call that makes your legs stop working. Ifeoma Nwosu took that call at 7:22 a.m. on the third floor of St. Raphael's General in Toronto. And when she hung up, she stood very still for 11 seconds. Because the voice on the other end had just told her that the hospital was being sued for $180 million, and that the lawsuit named her personally. She was the cleaning supervisor, the woman who mopped the oncology ward, the woman who ordered the sanitizing supplies and trained the overnight staff and made sure the floors were spotless before the morning rounds. She was not a doctor. She was not a nurse. She was not a lawyer. And she had just been named in the largest negligence suit in St. Raphael's history. She almost dropped the chart. She almost sat down on the floor, right there in that break room, and let herself fall apart. But she didn't. Because Ifeoma Nwosu had spent 31 years learning how not to fall apart in rooms that weren't designed for her. And she had a feeling, quiet and cold in the pit of her stomach, that she had seen something in that hospital that nobody else had. Something the lawyers were missing. Something that could change everything. She just didn't know yet if anyone would listen to her long enough to find out what it was. She arrived at St. Raphael's at 5 a.m. every morning. She left at 3:30 in the afternoon. In between, she was the kind of invisible that large institutions depend on without ever acknowledging. 14 years at the same hospital, the same corridors, the same elevators, the same supply closet on the second floor, whose door stuck every November when the humidity dropped. She knew which nurses took their breaks at 6:15. She knew which residents ate lunch at their desks and forgot to throw away the containers. She knew the patient in room 3111 liked his window blind half open. Not because anyone told her, because she paid attention. Because when your job is to keep a place clean, you learn to read a room the way other people read a book. Her name was not on any plaque in that building. It was not stitched on a white coat. It was embroidered on the left breast of a blue uniform, small letters, the kind of name tag that signals to the world that you are there to serve, and not to be served. Ifeoma. The nurses called her Iffy. The doctors didn't call her anything at all. Not with cruelty. Just with the comfortable blindness of people who have never needed to see the person holding the mop. There was one person in the building who always saw her. Raymond Achibi worked the overnight security desk at the main entrance. He had a thermos of tea, a worn paperback, and the habit of standing up when Ifeoma walked through the door every morning. "Morning, Doc," he'd say. She'd shake her head every single time. "Morning, Raymond. How's the third floor treating you?" Same as always. Someone left a coffee cup balanced on the biohazard bin again. The nerve, and Ifeoma would smile, small and tired, and take the elevator up. And Raymond would watch her go and think, as he had thought for 14 years, that there was something about this woman that the hospital had never bothered to understand. The lawsuit had been filed by the family of a man named Gerald Osei Bonsu, 62 years old, retired schoolteacher. He had been admitted to St. Raphael's 11 months earlier for a routine hip replacement. The surgery went smoothly. The recovery did not. Within 4 days, he developed a hospital-acquired infection, a specific strain of bacteria that had no business being in a post-operative orthopedic room. Within 3 weeks, he was in the ICU. Within 8 weeks, he was gone. His daughter Portia had hired the most aggressive medical malpractice firm in Ontario. The claim was simple and devastating. The infection had spread because St. Raphael's failed to maintain basic sanitation protocols on the third floor, and the person responsible for sanitation on the third floor was the cleaning supervisor. Ifeoma Nwosu. The hospital's legal team was led by a man named Christopher Vance, 47 years old, partner at Vance Holloway, the kind of lawyer whose suits cost more than Ifeoma's monthly salary, and who held meetings in rooms where the chairs had their own chairs. He had 3 junior associates assigned to the case, 2 infection control experts on retainer, and a stack of documentation 4 inches thick, proving that St. Raphael's sanitation protocols were compliant, current, and correctly implemented. What he did not have was the one thing the opposing team kept hammering in every pre-trial filing: a chain of custody for the cleaning logs on the 3rd floor between the 14th and 17th of March. 4 days. The exact window when Gerald Bonsu's infection took hold. The logs for those 4 days were incomplete, 2 entries missing entirely. One with a timestamp that didn't match the override records from the supply room. And without a clean chain of custody for those dates, Vance's entire compliance argument had a hole in the middle of it that Portia's lawyers were walking through with the confidence of people who already knew they were going to win. The trial was in 6 days. Vance was not panicking. He didn't panic. He delegated panic to his associates and maintained a face of controlled intensity that the partners had long ago mistaken for genius. But inside that controlled intensity, something was fraying. Because he had gone over those logs 40 times. His team had gone over them 40 times. The infection control experts had gone over them. And no one could explain the gap. Not in a way that would hold up in front of a jury. He needed an explanation. He needed documentation. He needed a human being who could stand on that witness stand and account for every hour of those 4 days on the 3rd floor, and he couldn't find one. His junior associate, a young woman named Blessing who had been at the firm for 8 months and was quietly running on 4 hours of sleep a night, had suggested twice that they talk to the cleaning staff directly. Not the supervisor, not the department head. The staff. The people who were actually on the floor those nights. Vance had nodded both times and done nothing. Not dismissively. Just with the particular inertia of a man who had been a lawyer for 22 years and had stopped believing that people without credentials could tell him anything he didn't already know. Blessing didn't argue. She never argued. She went back to her desk and worked until her eyes burned. She had wanted to be a lawyer since she was 11 years old, sitting in the kitchen of a rented house in Brampton while her mother pressed uniforms, and her father studied for his electrician's certification, and told her that if you got the education, you got the door. She had gotten the education. The door was open. But some mornings, standing in a hallway at Vance Holloway while someone walked past her like she wasn't there, she wondered if she had walked through the right one. It was 2:30 in the morning on a Wednesday when Ifeoma Nwosu came back to St. Raphael's. She wasn't scheduled. She had gone home at 3:30, eaten dinner, sat with the television on without watching it, and then at 11 p.m. she had stood up, put her coat back on, and taken the bus. She had her access badge. She had her keys. She had a feeling she couldn't name that was pulling her back to a specific filing cabinet in a specific supply room on the 2nd floor. She had been thinking about those missing log entries for 3 weeks. Not because a lawyer had asked her to, because they were wrong. Because she knew those logs. She had built the logging system herself 8 years ago, after a near miss on the 4th floor that nobody ever talked about publicly. She had designed the double-entry protocol, the timestamp verification, the override codes for the supply room. She knew every field in those documents the way a musician knows a score they wrote themselves, and she knew that something about the gap in those March logs wasn't absence. It was displacement. The entries hadn't disappeared. They had been filed wrong. She was almost certain. Almost. She needed to check. The supply room was quiet. The fluorescent light over the second shelf was still flickering the way it had been flickering since January. Ifeoma pulled open the third drawer of the gray cabinet. Physical backups. The ones nobody digitized because the system upgrade in 2022 had created a parallel paper trail that everyone forgot existed the moment the new software launched. She found the March folder. She opened it. Page 1, 3. She turned to the 14th. Her hand stopped moving. There it was. Not missing. Not corrupted. Filed under the wrong date stamp because a new overnight staff member, her second week on the job, had used the legacy date format instead of the updated one. March 14th was logged as the 14th of the third month in the old format, which the filing system had auto-sorted under a miscellaneous category nobody had thought to check. Ifeoma held the page under the flickering light and read every line. Every room logged, every chemical dilution ratio, every timestamp cross-referenced with the supply room override entries. The third floor sanitation on the 14th of March had been completed correctly, completely, thoroughly, by the book. The gap wasn't a gap at all. It was a filing error that had been sitting in a drawer for 11 months, while a lawsuit built itself around the space where those records should have been. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the fluorescent light to flicker twice and settle. She was holding in her hands the document that could close the gap in Christopher Vance's case, the document that could protect the hospital, the document that could, arguably, protect her. She thought about taking it upstairs. She thought about calling the hospital administrator. She thought about walking to the nursing station and leaving it on the desk with a note. But she also thought about the fact that she had been cleaning those floors for 14 years. She thought about every time she had handed a concern to a department head and watched it get nodded at and filed away. She thought about the infection control meeting in 2021 where she had raised a question about the new mop head protocol, and a doctor had looked at her with the particular patience people reserve for children and dogs. She set the original page back in the drawer. She photographed it with her phone, twice, from 2 angles, to make sure the date stamp and the signature were both clear. And then she pulled a single sheet from the notepad she kept in her coat pocket. She wrote 4 words, neat, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who has learned to be precise in everything, because imprecision costs you credibility you cannot afford to lose. She folded the paper once. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. She walked to the office of the ward administrator, the small room near the nursing station that doubled as a meeting room and occasionally a quiet place for residents to cry. The door was unlocked. She went inside. She left the note on the desk where the morning coordinator would find it. And then she took the elevator back down, nodded to Raymond, who was still at his desk, and walked out into the Toronto night. "Night, Doc," Raymond said behind her. She didn't correct him this time. The morning coordinator found the note at 6:50 a.m. She read it. She read it again. Then she called the ward administrator, who called the hospital's legal contact, who called Christopher Vance at 7:15 a.m. while he was in a cab. The note said 4 words. Check the paper backup, that was all. No name, no explanation, no indication of who had left it or why. Vance told his associate to get to the hospital immediately. He redirected the cab. Blessing arrived first. She found the ward administrator standing outside the supply room with the expression of someone who has just disobeyed something they cannot categorize. "What are we looking at?" Blessing asked. The administrator pointed at the open drawer, the March folder, lying open on top of the cabinet, the 14th. Blessing read it standing up. She read it a second time. Then she took out her phone and called Vance. "I found the logs," she said. "All of them." "Where?" Second floor supply room. Paper backup. They were misfiled. The entries aren't missing, they're here, every one of them. The third floor was cleaned correctly on all 4 dates. Silence on the line. How did you know to look there? I didn't. Another silence. Someone left a note. What kind of note? 4 words. On the ward administrator's desk. Nobody knows who wrote it. Christopher Vance stood in that supply room 20 minutes later, holding a page of cleaning logs under a flickering fluorescent light. He was a man who chose his words with the care of someone who billed by the 6-minute increment. He looked at Blessing. He looked at the administrator. He said, "Pull the access records for last night. Every badge that entered this building after midnight." The records came back in 40 minutes. 3 entries after midnight. 1 resident logged on the 4th floor. 1 nurse clocking in for her shift at 3 a.m. And 1 access badge registered to a member of the Environmental Services Department. Ifeoma Nwosu. Time of entry, 2:14 a.m. Time of exit, 2:51 a.m. Vance looked at the name. He looked at Blessing. He said, "Who is Ifeoma Nwosu?" Blessing knew. She's the cleaning supervisor. 3rd floor. 14 years at this hospital. She came in at 2:00 in the morning. 2:14. On her own. On her own. Vance picked up the paper backup. He looked at the date stamp. He looked at the signature on the log entry. He set it down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you should have been holding carefully for a long time already. "Get her in here," he said. "Please," Blessing added quietly. Vance looked at her. "Please," he repeated. They met in the hospital's 2nd floor conference room at 9 a.m. Vance sat at the head of the table, Blessing to his left, the hospital administrator across from him, and Ifeoma Nwosu in a chair at the end, still in her coat, her hands folded on the table, her face carrying the measured calm of someone who has learned to walk into rooms prepared to be doubted. She looked different from how Vance had imagined, not that he had imagined her. She had a stillness about her that he recognized from courtrooms. The stillness of someone who has thought everything through before they opened their mouth. "Mrs. Nwosu," Vance said, "thank you for coming. You asked me to come." She said it without sharpness, just precision. "You found the backup logs. I knew where they were. How? Because I designed the logging system. 8 years ago. The paper backup protocol was my idea." Vance was quiet. "Why didn't you come forward before now?" Ifeoma looked at him steadily. "With respect, Mr. Vance, this is the first time anyone from the legal team has spoken to me directly. Your team has been at this hospital for 4 months. No one came to the 3rd floor. No one asked the staff. No one asked me." The room was quiet. Vance did not break eye contact. "Walk me through what you found." She did. She explained the legacy date format. She explained the auto-sort error. She explained the difference between the digital system and the paper backup, and the exact reason a second-week staff member would have made that specific mistake, and why the correction would have been filed under miscellaneous. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes. Precise, sequential, every detail placed exactly where it needed to be. When she finished, Vance was quiet for a long moment. "You knew this for how long?" he asked. "I suspected it for 3 weeks, she said. "I confirmed it last night." "Why didn't you call the hospital administration 3 weeks ago?" Ifeoma looked at her hands. Then she looked back at him. "Because the last time I flagged a protocol concern at this hospital, I was told by the director of operations to submit it in writing, and it would be reviewed at the next quarterly meeting. That was 16 months ago. The concern was never addressed." Silence. "And you still came back at 2:02 in the morning to find the answer." "Someone died," she said. "A family lost their father. I don't have the ability to fix everything wrong with this institution, but I knew where that document was, and it was the truth. So I went and found it." She said it the way people say things they have believed so long they don't need to think before saying them. Vance stood up. He walked to the window. The Toronto morning was gray and cold, the lake somewhere out past the buildings, invisible but present. He turned back. Ace, Nwosu, I owe you an apology. She looked at him without expression. Not just for this case, for the fact that we spent 4 months in this building and never once thought to ask you. Ifeoma was quiet for a moment. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Vance. I didn't come back last night for credit. I came back because the truth was in that drawer, and nobody was going to find it by looking in the places they were already looking. She glanced at Blessing. And because someone was working themselves to the bone, trying to solve a problem that had a simple answer. It just needed the right person to go and look. Blessing pressed her lips together. She didn't look away. The hospital administrator leaned forward. Mrs. Nwosu, I want to talk about what this institution can do differently, starting with whether you've been given the resources and the access. We can have that conversation, Ifeoma said. But first you should make sure the lawyers have what they need. The family deserves a resolution. Mr. O.C. Bonsu deserves that. Vance nodded. He picked up his phone. He called his co-counsel. Clear the morning. We have the chain of custody. There was a pause on the other end. How? The cleaning supervisor found it. She'd known where to look for 3 weeks. Silence. She's been working here for 14 years, Vance added. We didn't ask her. He hung up. He looked at Ifeoma. I'd like you to come to a meeting with the full legal team this afternoon. Not to testify. To walk them through what you walked me through. So they understand the logging system from the person who built it. I'm working until 3:30. We'll schedule around you. She looked at him. He meant it. All right, she said. This is the part of the story they didn't know. The part Ifeoma had carried in silence for 14 years. She had not always been a cleaning supervisor. She had not always been invisible. Ifeoma Nwosu grew up in Enugu, Nigeria, the second of 4 children. Her father was a pharmacist. Her mother taught secondary school biology. The house they lived in was modest and full of books, and both her parents had the same 3 words they said to their children every night before dinner. Learn, observe, remember. Ifeoma had taken all 3 seriously. She studied biochemistry at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, graduated with distinction, and was accepted to a public health graduate program at the University of Toronto. She arrived in Canada in 2003 with 2 suitcases, a scholarship, and the absolute certainty that she was going to spend her career in infection control research. She completed her master's degree. She published a paper on nosocomial infection tracking in post-operative wards that her supervisor described as the most methodologically rigorous student paper she had reviewed in a decade. She applied to doctoral programs. She applied to hospital research positions. She applied and applied and applied. She had the credentials. She had the research. What she didn't have, she was told in various ways, and with varying degrees of politeness, was the Canadian experience. The references in the right networks. The name that opened the right doors. She was 31 years old. Her visa was converting to permanent residency, and she needed income. She took the environmental services position at St. Raphael's as a temporary measure. That was 14 years ago. The temporary measure had calcified into a career, not because she had failed, but because the door she had been told existed had turned out to be further down a longer hallway than anyone had told her. She had never stopped learning. She had never stopped observing. She had read every infection control protocol that came through that hospital. She had attended every public health seminar she could access. She had redesigned the cleaning logs, introduced the double entry system, reduced the 3rd floor's surface contamination rate by 34% over 3 years. and written a 12-page proposal for an updated sanitization protocol in 2019 that had been acknowledged by the department head with a thank you email and filed somewhere she could not locate. She was the most qualified person on that floor. She held a mop and nobody knew it. The legal team met that afternoon in the hospital's main conference room. 8 people around a table: Vance, 3 associates including Blessing, the hospital administrator, the director of operations, and 2 infection control consultants who had been on retainer for 4 months and who had not once in 4 months thought to look at the paper backup in the second-floor supply cabinet. Ifeoma stood at the whiteboard. She walked them through the logging system in 20 minutes. Step by step, the original design logic, the legacy format, the auto-sort error, the paper backup protocol. She drew the filing structure on the board in clear, clean lines. She answered every question. She did not hesitate. She did not hedge. She spoke with the precision of someone who had spent 14 years watching this institution operate from the one angle nobody had thought to look from. When she finished, one of the infection control consultants, a man who had spent 4 months reviewing digital records without finding the answer, took off his glasses and looked at the administrator. "We should have talked to her on day 1, he said. Nobody argued. The pre-trial conference was 3 days later. Vance's team arrived with the complete chain of custody, the paper backup logs authenticated, the logging system design documentation, and Ifeoma Nwosu prepared to testify as the architect of the protocol. Portia Osei-Bonsu's legal team had spent 11 months building a case around a gap that no longer existed. Their lead counsel reviewed the documentation overnight. The next morning, before the pre-trial conference began, she requested a private meeting with Vance. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, both legal teams met with the judge. The lawsuit was not dismissed. Instead, something better happened. Both parties agreed to enter mediation. The evidence had shifted the foundation of the case. The infection was real. The death was real. The grief was real. But the negligence claim against the sanitation department could not be sustained. What emerged from mediation was a different conversation. A serious examination of the post-operative infection protocols, a patient safety review, and a settlement that addressed the family's loss, without a verdict that had been built on a documentation error. It was not a perfect resolution. Portia Osei-Bonsu still had no answer for why her father had contracted that infection. But she had the truth of what happened clearly and without concealment, and that, her own lawyer told her quietly, was more than most families ever got. Ifeoma did not go to the mediation. She was working. But Blessing drove to St. Raphael's afterwards, still in her suit, and found her in the supply room on the 2nd floor, checking inventory. "It's over," Blessing said. "How over?" "Mediation. Both parties. The sanitation records held." Ifeoma nodded once. She kept counting. "The family," she said. "They're going to be okay," Blessing said. "They have answers. That matters." Ifeoma wrote a number on her clipboard. "Good," she said. Blessing looked around the supply room, the flickering fluorescent light, the gray filing cabinets, the chemical bottles organized with a precision that nobody on the legal team had thought to notice for 4 months. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Ifeoma looked up. "Your master's thesis, the one on nosocomial infection tracking. I found it last night. I read some of it." Ifeoma was quiet. "You designed this entire system based on your own research." "Yes, and they just let you stay here." It wasn't quite a question. Ifeoma set down the clipboard. She looked at Blessing for a long moment. "I let myself stay here," she said. "At some point I stopped pushing at the door and started building something I could control. This floor, these logs, the protocol. It isn't what I planned, but it's mine." She picked the clipboard back up. "And it just saved your case." "Yes," Blessing said. It did. The silence in the supply room was different from the silence in most rooms. It was the silence of two women who had found different versions of the same hallway and were still deciding what to do about it. Christopher Vance came to St. Raphael's one more time, a week after the mediation closed. He came to the third floor at 5:10 a.m. because that was when he knew she would be there, because Raymond at the security desk had told him, and because for the first time in a long career of billing by the 6-minute increment, he had decided that some things were worth his unpaid time. He found Ifeoma in the corridor outside room 3111, changing the mop head with the quiet efficiency of someone who has performed that action 10,000 times. "Mr. Vance," she said, not surprised. "Miss Nwosu." He held out an envelope. She looked at it. "What is this?" "A formal letter of commendation from the hospital board, and a request from the director of operations that you chair the new patient safety committee." She didn't take it immediately. "A committee. You would design the terms of reference, you would have budget authority, and a title that reflects what you actually do in this building." She looked at the envelope. She thought about a 12-page proposal filed in 2019. She thought about a thank you email that went nowhere. "I'll read it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He set the envelope on the supply cart. He looked at her. "I owe you more than a letter," he said. "I know that." "Then do better," she said. Not unkindly, just with the directness of someone who has learned that kindness and clarity are not opposites. "Do better for the next person who tries to tell you something you haven't thought to ask about yet." Vance nodded. He meant it, she could tell. The way you can tell the difference between a person performing accountability and a person actually sitting inside it. "Good morning, Ms. Nwosu." "Good morning, Mr. Vance." He left. She went back to work. Room 3111, window blind half open, the way the patient liked it. Some people carry expertise in silence, not because they have nothing to offer, but because the institution they're inside has never built a door at their height. Ifeoma Nwosu spent 14 years maintaining the cleanest ward in that hospital. She designed the system that solved the case. She found the answer at 2:00 in the morning on her own time with her own knowledge, and she left it in a note on a desk, 'cause the truth mattered more than the credit. The people who keep the lights on, who keep the floors clean, who know where every file is and why every protocol exists, they are not background. They are the building, and sometimes, when everything else fails, they are the only ones left who know where to look. 4 words on a folded piece of paper, left by a woman in a blue uniform at 2:51 in the morning, and not one person in that hospital had thought to ask her before then. Don't walk past people. You don't know what they're carrying. You don't know what they know. And you don't know what they could change if you just stopped long enough to ask. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Fresh African Folktales, because every story we tell carries something true inside it, and the next one might be the one that makes you look differently at the person you've been walking past every single day.